Chapter 52, Tabernacles, an escape to uncharted territory. The Passover is certainly the feast most familiar to Christians today, and the liberty that accompanies the presence of the Spirit is found at both the highest table and the crust shared in love in the lowest ditch. But there is another feast largely unknown to the Christian community, which ought to be given more scrupulous attention. The Passover commemorates the escape out of Egypt and the trek into the wilderness. But the wilderness was Israel's home for an entire generation. Before they entered the promised land, they lived as exiles in the desert. None of those living during the exodus from Egypt lived to enter the land of promise. While living in a land more barren than the one they left, they could not imagine a place better than Egypt. Yet their children's generation never saw the pyramids. They were born in the wilderness, and their ideas of both Egypt and the Promised Land were formed from the nebulous stuff of imagination. Passover was a time when their parents were forced to remember what was bad about their former home and to remember the God who rescued them. But there was another feast that they practiced in the wilderness. Not a feast of remembrance, but one of anticipation. On the 15th day of this 7th month, and for 7 days, is the Feast of Booths, Sukkot, to the Lord. On the first day shall be a holy convocation. You shall not do any ordinary work. For 7 days you shall present food offerings to the Lord. On the 8th day you shall hold a holy convocation and present a food offering to the Lord. It is a solemn assembly. You shall not do any ordinary work. Leviticus 23:34 through 36. Passover marks the beginning date of a new calendar. Its celebration was commemorated on the 14th day of what became the first month, Nisan. This calendar was centered on God's redemption of his people. This feast, known as Sukkot for the booths, called Sukkah, in which the people dwelt, was to take place during the 7th month, Tishri, at the end of the year. This was not the end of the festival calendar year, but the natural year, at the time of harvest. Thus it was also known as the Feast of Ingathering. You shall keep the feast of harvest, of the first fruits of your labor, and what you sow in the field. You shall keep the feast of ingathering at the end of the year, when you gather in from the field the fruit of your labor. Exodus 23:16. The feast is celebrated in autumn, when the crops ripened and the trees bore fruit. It is the belief of the sages that the first day of the month of Tishri was the day the world was created, because Adam was placed in a garden with trees bearing fruit. Thus, every year it is a memorial to Eden and a sign of future harvests yet to come, when all creation would be restored and renewed. Footnote: Tishri 1 is also believed to be Noah's birthday, the day on which the flood began, and, according to astrological interpretations of symbols in Revelation 12, the birth date of Jesus, coinciding with the date of September 11th, 4 BC, or 3 BC. End footnote. Booths, tents, tabernacles, or Sukkot. The Feast of Ingathering has a special significance beyond the harvest, a time celebrated in almost every other culture. Its name is given for the distinctive sukkah that the Israelites were told to construct for the occasion. On the 15th day of the 7th month, when you have gathered in the produce of the land, you shall celebrate the feast of the Lord 7 days. On the first day shall be a solemn rest, and on the 8th day shall be a solemn rest. And you shall take on the first day the fruit of splendid trees, branches of palm trees, and boughs of leafy trees, and willows of the brook, and you shall rejoice before the Lord your God 7 days. You shall celebrate it as a feast to the Lord for 7 days in the year. It is a statute forever throughout your generations. You shall celebrate it in the 7th month. You shall dwell in booths, sukkah, for 7 days. All native Israelites shall dwell in booths. that your generation may know that I made the people of Israel dwell in booths when I brought them out of the land of Egypt. I am the Lord your God. Leviticus 23:39 through 43. In the Orthodox Jewish community, a significant emphasis is placed on the 4 species of plants prescribed, and symbolic meaning is applied to them. But whether or not the symbolic element is central to meaning, the overall image is a picture of God's abundant provision. The booth is decorated with fruit to eat, the palm, which brings refreshing wind when waved, leafy branches that provide shade from the sun, and willows that grow near the calm waters of a brook, a sign of fresh and plentiful water. Observant scholars note that in the wilderness, these requirements could only be met at an oasis. As the Israelites were led through the wilderness, the Feast of Ingathering would occur in an island of fertility amidst the barren waste, just as Eden was the first cultivated space at the dawn of creation. The emphasis of the holiday was rest, taking place from Sabbath to Sabbath, a celebration of 8 days. This is a significant symbol representing completion, resurrection, and restoration. The 8th day, Shemini Atzeret, is the already and not yet of the Feast of Booths, a holiday in its own right, when the booth is no longer required, a day of transformation on which the circumcision takes place, when Abram becomes Abraham, and when Christ rose from the grave. The Feast of Tabernacles requires more sacrifices than any other holiday or festival. In the book of Numbers, the prescribed sacrifices are listed. Over the course of the 8 days, the sacrifices offered amount to 71 bulls, 15 rams, 105 lambs, and 8 goats, with the grain offering and the drink offerings for each bulls, for the rams, and for the lambs in the prescribed quantities. Numbers 29:18. Each day requires 1 goat to be offered as a sin offering, the reminder of our imperfection and our need for forgiveness. But beyond this, the purpose of all these other sacrifices was to be eaten as food. This was one massive barbecue, which meant that a lot of mouths were required. Sukkot is the most evangelistic of the feasts. Unlike Passover, which required circumcision prior to being celebrated, the Feast of Tabernacles was meant to be enjoyed by everyone in the land. You shall keep the Feast of Booths 7 days, when you have gathered in the produce from your threshing floor and your winepress. You shall rejoice in your feast, you and your son and your daughter, your male servant and your female servant, the Levite, the sojourner, the fatherless, and the widow who are within your towns. For 7 days you shall keep the feast to the Lord your God at the place that the Lord will choose, because the Lord your God will bless you in all that you produce, and in all the work of your hands, so that you will be altogether joyful. 3 times a year all your males shall appear before the Lord your God at the place that he will choose, at the Feast of Unleavened Bread, at the Feast of Weeks, and at the Feast of Booths. They shall not appear before the Lord empty-handed. Every man shall give as he is able, according to the blessing of the Lord your God that he has given you. Deuteronomy 16:13 through 17. The celebration of God's abundance was meant for all. It's a literal invitation to taste and see that the Lord is good. Psalm 34:8. Everyone was welcome, and there was no distinction among those who could come and celebrate. Perhaps this is the reason why the symbolism of Sukkot has been overlooked by the church, because the Feast of Tabernacles is an image of the age to come, and the penumbra of its glory is seen in the birth of the church. In other words, we are too close to the mountain to see its shape. Bringing in the fringe. The Feast of Tabernacles was the time when someone on the fringe could be welcomed in. The place that the Lord will choose was determined by the pillar of cloud in the desert, but later revealed to be Jerusalem, where Jesus went to celebrate it. Jerusalem is a natural oasis, fed by the Gihon Spring, a city that could thrive even amidst a sea of foreign invaders. This great strength allowed the city to remain occupied long after Joshua led the children of Israel into the promised land. Until David finally conquered the stronghold of the Jebusites, the feast could not be celebrated in their final place. After the tabernacle and the temple were set up in Jerusalem, it became the place of pilgrimage. Each year, the Israelites would make 3 trips to the city of David. For the first of these, the celebration of the Feast of Unleavened Bread, only the circumcised were permitted to partake. But for the latter 2 trips, during Pentecost and Sukkot, everyone who lived in the neighborhood was welcome to come along. During the exile, when the Jews were taken out of their homeland by the empires of Assyria and Babylon, they were also required to invite their neighbors to celebrate these feasts. When the Jews of the diaspora were finally allowed to return, many thousands streamed into Jerusalem to celebrate. We don't know how many foreigners made the trek with them, but 3,000 people who heard the message of the gospel in their own tongue were baptized into the body of Christ on the day of Pentecost. The book of Acts does not make a specific mention of the apostles celebrating the Feast of Booths, but the well-known passage on their communal generosity displays the spirit of the feast being practiced in their actions. Now the full number of those who believed were of one heart and soul, and no one said that any of the things that belonged to him was his own, but they had everything in common. Acts 4:32. While there is plenty to critique about the sustainability of their financial practices, the spirit of generosity was present from the earliest days of the Christian community. It was a tent where all were welcome, regardless of what they brought to the table. Jesus on Sukkot. The Gospel of John tells us of an occasion in which Jesus celebrated the Feast of Booths. He had been spending time in Galilee to avoid those who were seeking to kill him. His unbelieving, at that time, brothers wanted him to stop doing miracles and leave their hometown. The feast provided an excellent excuse to rid themselves of their problematic sibling. Now the Jews' Feast of Booths was at hand, so his brothers said to him, "Leave here and go to Judea, that your disciples also may see the works you are doing. For no one works in secret if he seeks to be known openly. If you do these things, show yourself to the world." For not even his brothers believed in him. Jesus said to them, "My time has not yet come, but your time is always here. The world cannot hate you, but it hates me because I testify about that its works are evil. You go up to the feast. I am not going up to this feast, for my time is not yet fully come." After saying this, he remained in Galilee. John 7:1-9. Jesus was referring to the time of his triumphal entry and the events of the Passion. Though he had narrowly escaped an attempt on his life for equating himself with God, as one older than Abraham, at this time he was still operating primarily in the role of a teacher and a prophet, rather than as a messianic leader. But after his brothers had gone up to the feast, then he also went up, not publicly, but in private. The Jews were looking for him at the feast and saying, "Where is he?" And there was much muttering about him among the people. While some said, "He is a good man," others said, "No, he is leading the people astray." Yet for fear of the Jews, no one spoke openly of him. John 7:10-13. Jesus approaches this feast as if he were one of the sojourners in the land, not a son of Israel. He was gaining an outside perspective on how the people on the fringe were being treated. Because this feast was open to all, there was a lot of confusion about identity. Under the cover of anonymity afforded to him by the feast, he begins to challenge the assumptions of the teachers by speaking truth without highlighting his credentials. About the middle of the feast, Jesus went up into the temple and began teaching. The Jews therefore marveled, saying, "How is it that this man has learning when he has never studied?" So Jesus answered them, My teaching is not mine, but his who sent me. If anyone's will is to do God's will, he will know whether the teaching is from God or whether I am speaking on my own authority. The one who speaks on his own authority seeks his own glory, but the one who seeks the glory of him who sent him is true, and in him there is no falsehood. Has not Moses given you the law? Yet none of you keeps the law. Why do you seek to kill me? At this point, the people did not recognize Jesus as the one who had fed the 5,000 and called himself the bread of life. The crowd answered, "You have a demon. Who is seeking to kill you?" Jesus answered them, "I did one work, and you all marvel at it. Moses gave you circumcision, not that it is from Moses, but from the fathers, and you circumcise a man on the Sabbath. If on the Sabbath a man receives circumcision, so that the law of Moses may not be broken, are you angry with me because on the Sabbath I made a man's whole body well? Do not judge by appearances, but judge with right judgment." John 7:14-24. Throughout his ministry, Jesus is consistently challenged by the Pharisees and others for breaking the Sabbath by doing the work of healing. Yet here, he challenged them on a topic they held of such great importance that it superseded the Sabbath laws: circumcision. Why was there such urgency about circumcision? For one thing, the Pharisees had been recruiting people to their cause, and circumcision was the means of bringing outsiders into the community. Jesus criticized this specific behavior on another occasion. "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you travel across sea and land to make a single proselyte, and when he becomes a proselyte, you make him twice as much a child of hell as yourselves." Matthew 23:15. There would have been urgency if a convert was expected to celebrate the Passover, and the need to be circumcised would have taken precedence over keeping the Sabbath. But the other, more common circumstance was for any child whose birth occurred 8 days prior to a Sabbath. It's important to note, Jesus does not condemn them for this practice. In fact, he points out that circumcision was from the fathers, the sign of a covenant formed prior to the time of Moses, and still in effect to that day. Jesus affirms that the law of the 8th day is higher than the law of the Sabbath. What was missing from their teaching was the spirit of the Sabbath and the spirit of tabernacles. Jesus' words rile up the crowd to a sufficient extent that the Pharisees sent for officers to arrest Jesus. He tells them, "You will seek me, and you will not find me," and then proceeds to disappear, with a few more days left to celebrate. Everyone seems to forget about him and move on until the 8th day of celebration. On the last day of the feast, the great day, Jesus stood up and cried out, "If anyone thirsts, let him come to me and drink. Whoever believes in me, as the scripture has said, out of his heart will flow rivers of living water." John 7:37-38. The 8th day was the great day, a mega day, literally megas in Greek. It was a day of abundance and overflow. This was not the first time that Jesus had used the description of living water. He had shared the same words with a Samaritan woman sitting at Jacob's well. "Everyone who drinks of this water will be thirsty again, but whoever drinks of the water that I will give him will never be thirsty again. The water that I will give him will become in him a spring of water welling up to eternal life." John 4:13-14. He shared this truth first with a stranger, but one who would be welcomed to the Feast of Booths. Jesus identified himself as the source of living waters. He is the oasis, the place where life begins, and the place that he will choose. A person who is also a place, like the womb of a mother or the side of Adam, out of which Eve is brought forth. He invites us in so that we can be brought out again, changed, transformed, born again, a bride suitable for a king. This is the purpose for which Jesus came into the world, to find a bride. And John begins his gospel by showing us the mode in which Christ came to make this journey. And the Word became flesh and tabernacled among us. John 1:14. Note, the word tabernacled is rendered as dwelt in most English versions, but in Greek it is skenu, the verb form of skini, which is rendered as tent or tabernacle. He tented among us. End of footnote. And end of chapter.